It's day 2 of the semi-finals in the Magnus Carlsen Invitational tournament, and I'd like to take a look at the match between Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, and Nepomniachtchi. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. I want to get to 100k subs, so join the gang, join me, let's get there together. If you're not a subscriber, please do hit the subscribe button. There's loads of great content on the channel. So here we go. Day 2 of the semi-final. Of course, Magnus Carlsen needed to win this second set just to go into a tie-break. Of course, he lost out on day 1. But the day did not start well. He drew the first game and then lost the second. Nepo in great form. So Carlsen needed to win games 3 and 4 just to get to a tie-break. Game 3 he managed to win. Very tricky game. This is game 4. Magnus Carlsen in a must-win situation. So Nepo has played his favourite Najdorf variation, Sicilian Najdorf. What's the point of this mysterious little move? Well, it's partly a waiting move. You're waiting to see how white commits his pieces before you commit your pawn to e6 or e5. But also, it can help in some queenside expansion to advance that b-pawn. But Carlsen plays a very pragmatic move, just a4. Obviously, just restraining that b-pawn. But also, it's basically not committing. So white is playing a similar kind of waiting game. A very pragmatic move. This is not the refutation of the Najdorf. I mean, if only for the fact that black can transpose into many other different systems. E6 is a Scheveningen, and G6 is a move that I like to play as black in this position, going into a kind of classical dragon variation. Knight C6 also very respectable. But Nepo plays in the typical Najdorf way, advancing that e-pawn 2 squares. Now this is slightly frowned upon actually. And the reason is this, that actually it allows white to get that bishop to c4. That was always the old way of playing the position with white. Bishop c4, and it was thought that white has a positional advantage. Maybe it's not so clear. Nepo has previously defended this position with black in the past, so he's obviously comfortable with this. But it's interesting, Carlsen, after a couple of minutes thought, remember it's a must-win game, played pawn to g3. Now this is really interesting because this is an unusual setup. Normally you play g3 against the Najdorf, but the knight will either drop back to b3 or e2. It's rare to have this combination, g3 with the knight on f3. But strangely enough, Anish Giri played this in the previous Play Magnus online event against Nepo himself. So this is the second time that Nepo has faced this within, the past month. So very curious. Nepo lost really badly. So in that game from the Opera Euro Rapid online tournament a month ago, Nepo played knight c6, but he was outplayed really beautifully by Giri, actually. More on that later. So this time he castled, Nepo castled. So this is a big improvement, apparently. And played bishop e6, fine. So he's delaying the development of this knight. Might come to c6, might come to d7. Carlsen played knight h4. Good move. I mean, this is one of the points of playing the knight to f3 in combination with the bishop on g2. That knight can hop into the f5 square, and particularly with the pawn on h6, once the knight is there, it's rather uncomfortable for black. You're not going to be able to play g6 because h6 is too weak. It's a beautiful square for the knight. But here, Nepo thought for a couple of minutes. I'm really surprised that, having suffered one very painful defeat in this line, that Nepo somehow wasn't better prepared. he thought for a couple of minutes here and played the standard knight d7, but as we'll see, there were certain drawbacks to that move. I think at this moment he had to improvise. The move that I quite like is queen here, just keeping tabs on the f5 square. I know it looks a bit odd to potentially block the knight, but you might well bring that rook to c8, and maybe the knight will hop here or even into d4 if allowed. So it looks a little bit odd, but I think that's a decent move. But instead Nepo played the standard knight d7. Carlsen continued with his plan. Knight f5, looking at some very sensitive squares, and indeed threatening a pawn. So Nepo just exchanged that off. Well, the knight has gone, but now this bishop has this wonderful diagonal across the board. The fact the pawn is on f5 double doesn't really matter. The key thing in this position is control over e4 and d5, and that bishop is absolutely wonderful. So queen c7 protects. a5, I mean, this is working just perfectly for Carlsen at the moment. Cramping that pawn. And see, that's great for the bishop. Rook b8, so the rook steps out of the line, so perhaps of the bishop, perhaps he's preparing b6. Bishop e3, very straightforward development. I mean, these bishops are wonderful, beautiful pieces. Rook c8, now that does prevent the knight moving for a moment because obviously there's going to be a threat here. Queen d3, but still white doesn't need to prove too much here. White's moves are so easy to make. The rooks are connected. We do like that on this channel. We don't like split rooks. And rook fc1. Very simple maneuver, very standard. The rook protects the c2 pawn and prepares at some point to bring the knight into d5. I mean, there are other alternatives, and possibly sometimes that knight might come to a4 and then into b6. That's an alternative plan. It's just a wonderful position for white. Very hard for black to get any meaningful counterplay here. Still, I thought the best might be to exchange queens here, but look, it's a really unpleasant position for black. Nepo sought activity with b6. But this falls right into white's plans. Pawns exchanged, and then rook takes a6. So Nepo's idea was that he's going to get some counterplay with this knight coming here, looking at the b-pawn, looking at the bishop. And very often in the Najdorf, you can sacrifice a pawn like this to get this kind of activity. In this case, Magnus plays it very well indeed. Knight d5, hitting the queen. Now, let me just show you what happens if the knight is exchanged off. Now, this did not happen, but I just want to show you what happens if black just takes this pawn. Here, you can see the bishop is in a beautiful position, looking at f7. The rook threatens to come to a7, supported by the bishop, which just cuts through to the pawn on f7. That's the basic threat. And it's really difficult to prevent this. So, for example, queen here. The rook steps in the way. Fine, we'll exchange. And then rook number 2 comes over, threatening rook a7. And again, f7 is going to collapse. In the meantime, this knight completely out of sorts, completely out of play. There really is no defense to white's very basic attack here. Star of the show, the bishop on d5. Wonderful piece. But strong supporting role from the bishop. I have to say, the other bishop. So, knight d5 played. Now, instead of exchanging, queen d8. But now Magnus has time just to consolidate. Remember, he's a pawn up. He still has complete control over the d5. And black has absolutely nothing here. This is Well, let me tell you, if you ever consider playing the Najdorf, this position is what you have to avoid as black. This is the Najdorf nightmare, where your opponent controls that beautiful d5 square and can land a piece there. If you have to recapture with a pawn, that's not good. But if you can land a bishop there, it's game over. And really, Carlsen just needs to keep a little bit of control. Watch how he did it. Rook a7. Black would very much like to just interpose on this square, but of course that bishop still controls the diagonal. Bishop d5. So you can see f7 is about to collapse. It's an absolutely miserable position for black to play. And white doesn't need to fear an endgame, not at all. Because black still has enormous problems on the 7th rank. That prevents the b-pawn advancing, but no bother. We take. And the bishop comes back. You can see that white has total control over the 7th rank. And king g2. You know, on a good day, that king might just step all the way up and support a rook coming to h7, and that would be checkmate. I remember I actually did that in one particular game, which was very satisfying, I have to say. Rook b8, rook f7. Of course, that can't be taken because of the exchange, and then the bishop drops. Bishop g7, and now he doesn't need the b-pawn. Here, Nepo resigned. The next move is going to be rook here, and it is game over. Let's just see what could possibly happen. Rook here, threatening the bishop. If the bishop steps back, it's mate, and if the rook comes here to guard the bishop, let's just step away, and bishop takes rook. Or if the rook moves away, rook takes bishop, completely winning. Now, just keep that position in your mind and have a look at the final position of Giri against Nepo from the previous online tournament. Watch. Double rooks on the 7th. Opposite colour bishops. That killer light square bishop. That's the position that Nepo resigned in that game against Giri. It is really uncanny, the similarities between these two positions. Quite extraordinary. So, well, an absolute disaster for Nepo, who lost that second set. So Carlsen managed to force a tiebreak. I'll show you what happens in the tiebreak, or what happened in the tiebreak, in the next video. So click away, it's coming soon, or you might have to wait for a little bit. But anyway, listen, thanks for watching. Bye.